There's a couple of studies done that showed that, this surprised the hell out of me, but ants are a major food source for like grizzly bears in late summer when berries fail. And even a study here in Oregon found that ants were a major food source also for black bears in Oregon. So a big animal like a bear depends on the ants for its food. I've seen lots of logs that were torn up by bears. I never thought that it was that important, but apparently it is. But then there's also, ants are predators themselves on a lot of the insects and so forth that attack forests. So one study, for example, found that ants reduce Douglas fir moth larvae by 85% by their predation. So if you get rid of all the down logs and you sanitize the forest and you get rid of all the snags, you take away the forest's own natural, sort of you might say, protection from other insects that might otherwise attack the trees. When fallen logs fall in the streams, you know, here in the Pacific Northwest for a long time the Forest Service would go and drag out all these logs out of the streams because they thought it was better for the fish. And then they realized that the logs were really good for the fish. In fact, some studies show today that there is no upper limit to how much wood you could have in a stream. In other words, the more wood, the more fish. And now the Forest Service is dragging logs back into the stream that they took out before. But the logs are very important both for habitat for the fish as well as the insects that fish and other aquatic animals depend upon. So it also stabilizes the shoreline and provides a whole lot of other benefits. Fallen logs, this is something I took this summer in Yellowstone Park. It's kind of an interesting thing. This fire in '88, the logs fell over, and these aspen are all growing up in the middle of this log jam because the elk can't get in there and browse on them. So 100 years from now, somebody's going to come there and find this nice aspen grove. All these logs will have been rotted out, and they won't realize that the reason that they got the big aspen groves was because of the dead logs from the 1988 fire that protected the aspen so that it could grow for 100 years, or enough to get high enough to get above the elk browsing stage. Got everything from, you know, fungi. One study in Montana found that 40% of all fungi come in only after a fire. So, you know, I don't know if this applies everywhere, but it's just the point. The important point is that there are a lot of things going on that we don't know about. Even here in the Pacific Northwest, all these down logs, particularly big logs, are important as shoreline protection against erosion, as well as when they fall into estuaries, for example, young fish, salmon, coho salmon depend on having those logs in the estuaries. Various other crabs, etc., depend on them. And so you just can't think of a dead tree as a wasted resource. That's basically the point I'm trying to make here. And when you look at the ecological difference between logging and wildfire, one of the big differences is biomass. After a fire, you have all this biomass still left here, whereas if it's a log place, it's sanitized. There's no snags. There's no dead wood. So, go on to another point. Why didn't Yellowstone burn in 1986 or 1987? Why did it burn in 1988? I mean, there really was just as much fuel there in 1986 as there was in 1988 or 87. Well, is it fuel that drives large fires? Big fires are like driving a car. I don't know about you, but when I had to learn how to drive a car, it was really hard. Because my dad took me out and had a stick shift and all this, and I had to be able to remember to push on the clutch. At the same time, I pushed on the accelerator, and then I had to remember to shift the stick all at the same time, and I kept stalling out. Oh, it was very frustrating. I was very nervous when I got to a light or something. But if you do all those things together, the car moves. But if you fail to do any of them, the car doesn't do anything. I can go on and turn the key to ignition to the car. The car doesn't move because of, unless I shift the gears. I can go and sit in the car and I can push on the accelerator where I want, give it lots of gas, but if I don't have the ignition and shifting the gears, it doesn't go. In other words, you have to do all these things together. Well, it's very similar with big fires. You got to have primary thing is drought. And if you look around the West for the last couple of decades in particular, we've been having a lot of drought. They've had the worst drought in the Southwest in the last 500 years. Does that have anything to do with the big fires they've been having there? Well, maybe. Tom Swetnam, who's a fire climatologist at I think it's the University of Arizona, whichever one is in Tucson. I always get them mixed up, Arizona State or University of Arizona in Tucson. And he was very much an advocate of the fuels drives fires, but he's starting to change his mind. And he's become convinced that climate is the primary driver. And what happens is when you have another research that was done in Idaho found that the powerful influence of climate is a precipitate time, may be difficult in a warmer future that promotes severe fires. This is another important point, is we're trying to do restoration now based on the climate of the past 50 or 60 years before us, and we're into a new climatic regime now that may be more typical of something of 100 or 200 years ago. So you have extreme drought. Whenever you get that, you get that. But the other thing is, in the West, we also have greater variation in precipitation compared to the East. So, you know, you're in a place that gets 20 inches of rainfall a year, and you get 5 less inches of rain. That's 1/4 of your precipitation. Back east in some place like Vermont, they say they have a drought. They have 50 inches of rain, and they get 45, and that's a drought. Well, the difference between 45 and 50 isn't nearly like going from 20 to 15. This is showing the drought monitor for 2008, just to show you how much of the West was suffering from drought. Oh, I hit the wrong one, sorry. Another thing that happens with drought is you get low nighttime humidity. And one of the things, if you're fighting fires or you watch fires, you'll see that they usually die down at night because the humidity goes up. But in very dry years, the nighttime humidity doesn't go down very much, and so fires spread even at night. A really big fire factor for big fires is wind. And this is something, I've read all these different reports around the West about big fires, and almost every big fire, wind will be a big driving factor. If you've got the drought alone and you don't get wind, the fires just don't spread that fast. But if you get the wind in there, it really shifts a lot. And wind doesn't affect fire in a linear fashion. It affects it exponentially. So if the wind is blowing 15 miles an hour, that's the lower chart of spread showing. If you take it to 20 miles an hour, you can see the rate of spread is much greater. So if you have a wind that's blowing, and listen to the news, you'll hear it like down in Southern California. They had some Santa Ana winds blowing last year, 100-mile-an-hour winds. Hurricane force is 75 miles an hour or something like that. No wonder the fires are jumping 12-lane freeways and so forth, because they're getting spread by the wind. And this pattern in Yellowstone from the air shows that. You get what's called spotting. You see all these little burn areas. That's where the wind has blown sparks ahead of the fire. You can even see sort of the direction from the wind. And that's why it's impossible to stop fires when there's a wind, because you're out there, you're building a little trench with your shovel or even a bulldozer, maybe you know, as wide as 20 feet or something, and you got the wind is blowing sparks a mile and a half ahead of the fire. How can you stop that? You can't. This is in Yellowstone in '88. I want to point out two things. Obviously, this is a paved road here. That's a fuel break ultimate, right? There's nothing on that road that burns. Didn't stop that fire. The other thing is, look how far apart all those trees are. Now we're talking about going and thinning the forest here, and we're going to stop the big fires. They're not talking about thinning like that. Those trees that's way thinner than any thinning project is ever going to be, and it didn't stop the fires in 1988, and it won't stop it now. Rivers. This is the Biscuit Burn, the Illinois River. Fire went right across that river. That's a pretty good fire break. There's no fuel there. Didn't stop it. Here's Clear Cut in Montana in the background. Didn't stop this fire. Went right through it. No fuel there. And so when winds are fanned by winds, it's impossible. You got to just get the hell out of the way. I love this picture. I didn't take it. All right. So here's when I went to a thinning project on the Lowland National Forest last year, just to show you. And just two things to point out. Again, the trees are still a lot denser than anything I showed you in that previous picture. The second thing is there's no biomass there. There's no dead logs. There's no snags. That is a very sanitized forest that in the future is not going to function. This is an unhealthy forest. This is forest on health. The same thing, this is a thin ponderosa pine forest by Flagstaff, Arizona. Again, look at how barren that forest is. Man, if I was trying to hide under there, even a vole would have a hard time finding a place to hide.